What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Antoine Malone, and I like to think and discuss things with a Christian worldview. We have been talking a lot recently about critical race theory. Voddie Baucham's been one of the strongest voices against critical race theory, and I found this fascinating little snippet of an interview. I'll post a video to the whole presentation in the description. But he describes here really the fundamental question that I'm in arguments and discussions about in my Facebook page and on emails and every communication platform I have, whether critical race theory is a analytical tool or is it a worldview. And so we're going to hear Voddie give a response to this, and then I'm going to respond back to him. So let's take a listen.
And I thought, you yourself in the book, you highlighted something that you described as the $1 million question. And for me, I thought it was sort of the $1 million statement in the book. And your question was whether CRT is a worldview or merely an analytic tool. And one of the reasons I thought that was so important is because I've seen people say, CRT is unbiblical or there are problems with it, but it can be a useful analytic tool. I wonder if you would unpack, because I think that is just a critical point. So I wonder if you would unpack a little bit what the difference is between those two.
Yeah, CRT is a worldview with clear presuppositions. Some of the main tenets of CRT, and this is not me, these are the leading proponents and exponents of CRT who say that their main tenets are things like, number one, racism is normal, right? In relationships between people and in the power dynamics between groups, racism is normal and it's unavoidable. Everything is racist.
Okay, so we're going to go and listen to these as he tackles one tenet after the other. I'm just going to respond to those tenets, so I don't have to try to respond to everything at the end. So he's right. The first tenet is that racism of critical race theory is that racism is normal and unavoidable. That is one of the tenets. Now, I would take issue, or I do have some issues with unavoidable. I do see it as normal, though. It's a normal thing. It's not a weird thing when we hear about something happening that's race based, but it sounds like something that's been normalized. Where he makes a leap in his statement here is he says it's normal, he says it's unavoidable, and then he says everything is racist. Now, there's a big jump. There's a big gap between something that's normal and something that is the source of everything, right? And I don't think critical race theory says that everything is racist. And I think it's important to note that jump, that the first half of that can be true about what the statement is saying, but the second half of that assumes or puts too much on what the statement is saying. And I think that Voddie does this often when he describes these tenets. He puts too much on what the statement is saying. What critical race theory, one more thing, and then we'll let him finish. Critical race theory is dealing with the social and civic aspect of society. And so even if you find some literature that does say everything, it means everything in the sphere of civic legislative life. And you can agree or disagree with that, but it's not saying that race is the original sin of all sins in all of humanity for all time. If it were saying that, then that would rise to the level of a worldview. But because critical race theory is focused very specifically on American, most of it is focused on American history, looking at American legislative and the civic environment inside of America, historically and modern day, that niche where it's speaking into disqualifies it from being a worldview and qualifies it for being an analysis of a very specific aspect of our society. And so when we make these statements, this is where Voddie and I disagree. Voddie makes this statement rise to the level of sin, of original sin, as the start of all things sin. Race is the original sin, or racism. It sounds as if Voddie is insinuating here, when in reality is the critical race theory doesn't want to isn't attempting to evaluate human behavior in all aspects of life across all international communities throughout all time. It's America, it's the civic aspect of America, and even more specifically, the laws, the political maneuverings, and the mindsets that we might have as we interchange with each other through those laws. That's what critical race theory is really getting at. So the first issue is not a worldview because it's focused on America. Second issue is while it's true that race is normal and even unavoidable, you can make the case because of our environment. And so, we can debate that, but this leap to race, everything is racist, is a leap and not exactly what critical race theory suggests.
Secondly, one of CRT's tenets and presuppositions is that it's called interest convergence theory. White people are incapable of righteous actions on race unless their interests converge with minorities. So again, you've got original sin. Now you've got, the whole idea of total depravity. These are religious terms, and they use.
Okay, so you see what he did there. He said original sin. He's associating original sin the way we understand it as the bed of all things sinful. He just what I said a minute ago. He's suggesting that critical race theory is saying that racism is the original sin of all of humanity, which is, of course, not what critical race theory is saying. That's why he said first you have original sin, which was that first line. Now he's coming to the second one, and he's saying this other one sounds like total depravity, which is total depravity is the idea that because we are born as sinners, that we cannot work ourselves. We can do no good thing apart from Christ. Christ does good things. We can do no good thing. We are totally depraved. That's what that concept means. And so he's making a connection to this interest convergence conversation where, again, we're talking about civic life. We're talking about legislative. We're talking about laws. We're talking about America. And interest convergence says, he describes it well, with the exception of one word. He uses the word incapable. Incapable is doing all the heavy lifting in this line. Critical race theory doesn't say that white people are incapable of doing anything that is right and good that does not align with their interests. It is suggesting that by default, the natural orientation of the white community, as certainly as we've seen historically and modern day, is that when it looked like white America was doing the right thing for the right reasons, we found out that, well, there was something in it for them too that motivated them beyond just doing it right. And in American history, this critical race theory would say that there's very few, if any, scenarios where the right thing was done where pertaining to race when there wasn't something to get from it, or the right thing was done sacrificially. Now, again, critical race theory is thinking about the legislative aspects, the governmental and the governing political aspects of America. Of course, we saw Dr. King march with black, brown, and white people to end the civil rights movement. And those were sacrifices. White people were beaten just as much as black people were beaten. And they didn't do it because they were getting something out of it. Right. So critical race theory doesn't ignore those contributions. It's not speaking to those contributions. It's speaking specifically to the American governmental, the civic, the political, the social sort of aspects, the civic life and the political power that governs that civic life with laws and legislation. Those are the things that critical race theory is speaking to. And it suggests that in politics, it is very unusual to find people acting purely in someone else's interest, and certainly not at the risk of their own interest. If there's look, I agree with the warning that he's saying, but if there's any one of these tenets that feel true day by day, interest convergence is one of them. None of us expect politics. We would be surprised to see politicians act in a way that they're just going to do the right thing, even if that means they're not going to be elected again, and so forth and so on. So interest convergence, more people agree with that than they realize. They just don't want to associate it to whiteness, but they might associate it to politicians.
Religious terms. The third one is an anti-liberalism, not believing in things like objective truth and meritocracy and enlightenment, right? Reasoning and so on and so forth. And then the last one is
so anti-liberalism, and he said that particular tenet, and he's really paraphrasing or categorizing it here, but he says anti-enlightenment, anti-objective truth, and meritocracy. So let's deal with those one at a time. Anti-enlightenment. Enlightenment, what he means by that is critical race theory says that we need both, that the facts associated with something do not tell the entire story, just the data, just the statistics, but adding multiple points of view can help us arrive to a fuller version of the truth. And I think he's going to get more into that probably in this next tenet. With regard to meritocracy, critical race theory suggests that while America believes that and promotes that meritocracy is the best way to move forward, critical race theory realizes that actually the American dream is built on people earning money from other people working hard and doing things. And most of them, and much of America and the American dream is built not on the work that you yourself produce, but on your ability to make opportunity or leverage or invest in and receive the benefit from others who work. And therefore, critical race theory says meritocracy is not the only, or in many cases, best ways forward. Most of us would understand that if you really want to be wealthy, then you want to establish a business and get others to work for you, or you invest, or you do a number of things that don't necessarily associate you directly with the work that you're gaining profit from. So critical race theory just alleviates the concept, or at least attacks the foolproof idea that America is built on meritocracy. It turns out that meritocracy can be used to exploit those who are desperate and who have little means to enrich those who do, whether that's white, black, or otherwise. And then the last one he said was it was enlightenment. It was let's see, what was that third one? Meritocracy and objective truth. Same thing. We talked about this a minute ago. So most people associate critical race theory with postmodernism because they're like, hey, you don't want to accept one thing to be true. You don't believe anything is objective. When again, the reality is that what critical race theory is making sure is that we get as many sources of truth as possible to contribute to what is true. Critical race theory doesn't say that the sky is green or anything like that. Or it doesn't believe, it's not saying that there's no such thing as objective truth. It is saying that the truth of history that we've learned and the things that we've learned historically have been told to us from a particular narrative. And to get the best, fullest picture, you need to add other voices to that narrative. That doesn't make the truth not objective. It just makes it incomplete. And as you continue to add the pieces to it, you fill out the puzzle and you see the full picture of the puzzle rather than just the parts that some people chose to put together. And so that's all that is.
It's this idea that knowledge is culturally, constructed, socially constructed, and that the way that we come to knowledge is through narratives. And so because white people are the oppressor and minorities are the oppressed, the oppressors can't have insight into what's going on unless and until they elevate the voices of minorities. And that ought to sound very familiar because we're hearing that everywhere, right? We got to elevate Black voices. We got to elevate, LGBTQ voices. We got to elevate the voices of minorities. Well, the reason that we have to do this, according to CRT, is because that's the way that we come to knowledge. So, these are.
Okay, so once again, there's a couple things here. I just talked about this. When he says come to knowledge, he's making that a worldview statement, like to know all things. That's not exactly what critical race theory is doing. It's saying this whole concept he's just finished talking about, this social construction of truth, if you will, isn't capital T truth, all things true, ever, ever, ever. It's what's the truth of slavery? What's the real picture of slavery? What's the real picture of the Native American and Christopher Columbus, Native Americans and those who landed on the shores? Well, if we listen to Christopher Columbus and only his side of the story and only read his records, we do indeed get one part of the story. But we could also and should also seek to find out the Native American side of the story. If we find out that aspect of the story, it will fill in the truth of that reality of what was going on there even more. And so that social construction, meaning this, we make sure we get the narratives from multiple points of view. Like there's two sides to every issue, right? To get the narratives from multiple points of view, the social construction allows us to get that truth. The reason you elevate voices of those who are people of color and elevate voices of other marginalized groups is because they have been, whatever the opposite of elevated, they have been diminished. They have already been pushed down. The stories that have been told has not included their narrative or their story or their point of view to the incident. And so you need to elevate them out of the place of obscurity into a place where they can contribute to the conversation qualitatively. So the conversation is not what critical race theory is not saying is that if you want to know anything ever about any subject, no matter what the subject is, you got to go find a Black person or a brown person to tell you that. If it were saying that might rise to the level of a worldview statement. That would be saying that all Black people actually are the people who hold true knowledge of all things. And if that's the way Voddie is hearing that, then he is stretching it into a anthropological world, almost religious level of thinking. When critical race theory, again, is speaking very specifically to the American culture and the society, the civic life of American culture, and the governing aspects of American culture. And all these tenets have to do within that single sphere. And so when he talks about storytelling, he's talking about storytelling of American history, not of all things history ever, although that's a good idea to bring multiple sides to the story whenever you're looking in history. But it's just talking about, hey, if you really want the story, make sure you get the point of view from everybody who was involved. And to this point, the points of view of people of color have been minimized. And so we've got to elevate them in order to get them to the place where they will actually contribute to the story. So it's not about making one voice higher than the other. It's just about contribution.
Among the most fundamental assumptions of critical race theory. So the only way that we can use this as an analytical tool is if we bring over these lenses through which CRT views the world. And immediately, right, the idea that, everything is, power dynamics and oppressor oppressed, that's Marxism. That's not scripture, that's Marxism. The idea
the oppressor and oppressed existed prior to Marx. Jesus talks about oppressor and oppressed. He tells us how to respond to that in Matthew 5, as he's talking to the Jews who believed themselves to be oppressed by the Romans. This is what he means when he talks about the Pharisees lording their authority over whomever they have authority. Oppression shows up, of course, in the minor prophets with Amos, with Hosea, with even Jeremiah and Isaiah. These oppressor and oppressed is not a Marxist idea. That's a human idea. And the concept that there are aspects of a culture that have power and that have more power than other aspects of the culture is normal. Perhaps oppress is too strong a word because it creates too aggressive a picture. But the idea that there are those who have power and protect that power over others who don't have it is the very picture of oppression, at the very minimum. And there's multiple forms. There's the highest form of oppression, and there's a minimum, but oppression is oppression. So this concept of oppressor and oppressed is not new, and did not originate with Marx. As we can talk about Marx later. Let's just finish this up.
The idea that everything is racist, and so we have to view America through that lens itself. Again, you can't get there from any kind of, biblical reasoning. The idea that white people, are incapable of righteous actions on race.
See, there it is. Incapable is what's doing the work there. No, that's not what the tenet says. That's not what the tenet says. It says, it suggests that white people, and again, the social constructed white, so it's not even talking about white skin, but that white people act in their own interests always, even when it looks like they're doing the right thing. And that is not common for the social constructed idea of white in America to see those who are politically powerful act sacrificially in the interests of others. That's all it's saying. It's saying that if you take your hands off the wheel, that the natural defaults will be that you align with your own interests. And that's actually very biblical. Sacrifice does not come natural to us. It actually aligns with biblical ideas about humanity in general.
Again, you just can't get there from here. So the fundamental presuppositions of this worldview are at odds, not only with biblical Christianity, they're at odds with basic rational thinking. And so we have to reject this.
Well, there you go. So it sounds like Voddie Baucham believes that these tenets have the farthest reaching application possible. That where he and I differ is I read these tenets and I attach them to the civic American historical life as a critique of civic American historical life, to understand how laws and why laws were created and why they were effective or ineffective, and how that helps us make better laws in the future, how that helps us counter our default mentalities, how that helps us include and change our methodologies for how we teach history and teach our own history, our own patriotic history. What it does not do is eternally and completely villainize white people as the devil, as the one who could do no good thing, the one who has no knowledge because they're not brown or otherwise, and the ones who accept objective truths as opposed to everyone else who just wants to say whatever they want is true is true. And it's just not. We have two different viewpoints on that. So